It's Jerry Ward, and I'm back with I Object, Justice Examined. And you might have noticed that I'm on for a second time in the month. I'm now airing twice monthly, so be sure and listen about every other week for the show. And today I've got a great guest, Michael Scheuer, who wrote Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. But first, I want to bring my regular guest who appears with me every show, and that is the famous and very well-written Ilana Mercer, who is a classical liberal writer. She writes a weekly column, Return to Reason, for WorldNet Daily. She's also written for Free Market News Network, Front Page Magazine, Globe and Mail, Calgary Herald, Ottawa Citizen, Vancouver Sun, and many other publications, and including the Ludwig von Mises Institute. She's also the author of a book I highly recommend called Broadsides, One Woman's Clash with a Corrupt Culture. Ilana, welcome back.
Hi, Jerry. You mean infamous, not famous.
Well, I think you're pretty famous, too.
Oh,
You're famous to me.
Well, that's all that matters.
Do you want to be known as infamous?
Well, not at all, but certainly by the, Demo-Republican, duopoly. I'm not favored by them exactly. But it's good to be known by the right people, and you definitely are the right people.
Well, I will say this is definitely the libertarian stop on Right Talk Radio, and I'm very happy and proud to have you join me on these shows because your writing is one of the best of the classical liberal writers that's out there. And last week you had another great column in WorldNet Daily, and it was about the fence and the border control. And basically, apparently one of the big opponents to the fence now is the environmental movement. And you just pretty much took them apart in your column. You want to talk about what the new attacks on the fence on the border are?
Well, as you know, the environmental lobbies just about hate anything that is a byproduct of human existence, development, industry, technology, but with exceptions. If it's filth or, vast latrines and landfills generated by illegal aliens crossing the border, then that is to interfere with that outsized outhouse is to jeopardize the quality of life and beauty of South Texas, as one environmentalist put it. So yes, they were basically objecting to something that Johnny-come-lately, Michael Chertoff, Johnny-come-lately to the idea of a border put forward, and that was to use his discretionary waiver authority to temporarily suspend a few of the many land management laws that we have, of course. You know, the EPA is an incontinent legislator. So he was going to suspend some of these laws, which basically, I guess, say that if you stick a pole in the ground, you must be sure to relocate the anthill. And to begin erecting the fence that was promised under the, what act was that? The Secure Fence Act, I believe.
Yes.
Yes. Now, certainly a defense is a very contentious issue, and most libertarians, to distinguish between libertarians and classical liberals, but most libertarians reject defense. But of course, I don't. I think it's the quintessential non-aggressive method of defense. I liken it to lifting your hands up to defend yourself. You know, you're not attacking, arresting, or otherwise molesting undesirables. You're just keeping them away. But of course, this tear down the wall humanitarians, they never protest, fences between India and Pakistan or Thailand and Malaysia. And in fact, the fence between Turkey and Syria is mined. Come to think of it, the Egyptians are erecting a fence between them and the Gaza Strip. They're not very interested in welcoming these Hamasniks into their land. So
is that in addition to the wall that was there that Hamas recently blew holes in?
I think they are refortifying that because, the Gazans overwhelmingly elected Hamas, and Hamas is a ribcage of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Egyptians are not exactly enthusiastic about them streaming into their land.
Well, you and I have talked about the fence before, and I live in Texas, and one of my favorite vacation spots is along the border, especially in the Big Bend area. And I know the environmentalists talk about this as fragile land. Actually, it's pretty tough land down there. It's pretty remote, and a lot of it's scrub land. But, the problem I have with it is that there's kind of been a symbiotic relationship on both sides of the border, at least in the Big Bend area, where people have vegetable plots on both sides of the river. Sometimes the river shifts course. And because I don't have any level of trust whatsoever for for any governmental bureaucracy, I'm afraid that when they build this fence, they're going to stomp all over property rights. That's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about the environmental aspects.
Well, certainly. I mean, that's a very valid point, and you actually do live there, so you can enlighten us. But you and I would agree that in a free society based on absolute private property rights, it is very likely that landowners were subject to. The left liberal Time magazine described the ordeal of ranchers on the border, and it's really heartbreaking. There's the unrelenting crossover into ranchers, discarding of backpacks, of water bottles, soiled clothes. The land has been turned, in many cases, into a vast outhouse. There's revolting mounds of personal refuse. Illegals cut fences and cattle eat the plastic bags. There are plastic bags, apparently, enough to stock many Walmarts over and over again. Cows and cattle have to be killed because these bags lodge between the stomachs. There's poisoning of dogs. The tsunami of trespassers is relentless. Not to mention crime. It's a very scary reality. So certainly in a society based on absolute property rights, I believe ranchers would organize into militia and repel these people. But we live in an unfree society, and therefore, what is the option? The state has to somehow simulate that protection, while at the same time compensating those who reject it. And I do believe that these waivers are not interfering whatsoever with litigation between private landowners and the department.
Well, yeah, and actually, some of my extended families has actually been victim of criminals coming across the border in the 1980s, and so I totally understand the fear of that. In fact, there's a book by a woman named Hattie. She was a rancher that started ranching up or at the Big Bend in the early 1900s, and her husband always told her, if people come across the border and they stand at the fence, go take them water. If they try to come in the fence, shoot them immediately.
Yes, but what happens if she shoots them and she's in their rights? Certainly, in my opinion, she would go to jail. We know
Well,
that.
in the 1920s, she wouldn't have gone to jail, but that's part of the interference with the government and to property rights.
Sure, but now she would, and we know that even if you work for the government, think Ramos and Campion. You go to jail if you defend your country or your property.
It's a narco-tyranny. They allow the illegals to run amok, and then they tyrannize those who would protect themselves.
Absolutely. But think about over 80% of the numbers of Israelis maimed and murdered by suicide bombers. The fence is cut by over 80%, that number. So these things are rather passive, non-aggressive methods of defense, probably the best in a very bad bunch.
It's very unfortunate that it's probably a necessity because it's going to bring such a change to the border. But let's go on. I want to ask you, what's your column for tomorrow about?
Tomorrow we will be rounding up the Petraeus Crocker Croc.
And that's about Petraeus and Crocker testifying before Congress the last few days?
The croc basically goes on.
Okay, well, tell everybody where they can find it.
Again? Just repeat it?
Tell everybody where they can find your
They can find it on worldnetdaily.com or on my website, ilanamercer.com, tonight.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with me, Ilana, and we'll be talking together in 2 weeks.
Indeed. Okay, dear. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And now, I want to introduce my next guest, who is the author of a great new book that I just got through reading called Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. His name is Michael F. Scheuer. He is a New York Times and Washington Post best-selling author who's not only written that book, but numerous others, such as Imperial Hubris, Why the West is Losing the War on Terrorism, and Through Our Enemy's Eyes, Osama bin Laden, Radical Islam, and the Future of America. He was also the former head of the CIA's bin Laden unit, and he resigned from the CIA in November of 2004 after nearly 2 decades of experience in covert action and national security issues related to Afghanistan, South Asia, and the Middle East. He also holds a BA, 2 MAs, and a PhD. He is presently an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University, a consultant for CBS's 60 Minutes, and a senior fellow and regular contributor to the Jamestown Foundation's terrorism focus. Mr. Scheuer, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
I'm very excited about talking with you because, as I told you, I just finished reading your book, and I have to say that I think that your book is very courageous. I like the way you don't pull any punches in your book, and I also like the way you're getting lots of pushback from people that I don't agree with. So to me, that shows that you're doing something right, and we're going to talk about all of that. But first of all, would you explain to the folks a little bit about what kind of experience did you get in Middle Eastern affairs and foreign affairs, and also knowledge about how to best protect our country from your experiences in the CIA? Would you just describe that for us a little bit?
Well, sure. I spent 20 of my almost 23 years at the CIA running covert operations against various of America's enemies. I started by helping to support the Afghan Mujahideen when they drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan. I worked against narcotics traffickers in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then the last 10, almost 11 years of my career, we spent chasing Osama bin Laden and trying to kill him. To be fair, Mr. Clinton had a chance to kill him. Mr. Bush really only had one, and he missed it. Mr. Clinton could have killed him about 10 times. But most of my experience on the Middle East comes from actually working it. I was trained as a historian, but my PhD is in British Empire.
Well, that's one of the things that interests me is the fact that a lot of your education is in history, because as things stand now, and let me tell you, I'm a proud member of the Ron Paul Revolution, and there are probably many things that you and I would agree about this, and some that we would disagree, because I'm a proponent of just war, and I noticed in the book that you have more of a Jacksonian approach to war. And
I never thought, ma'am, that really just war meant pacifism. I think somewhere along the lines after 1945, the just war theorists became more pacifist than anything else.
So,
and I think we're in trouble because of that.
Okay, so you think that actually St. Augustine's just war was actually deformed by some more recent philosophers?
Oh, I think so. We fought, World War II was clearly a just war, and we applied a level of violence in World War II that was necessary to destroy our enemy and protect America. Mm-hmm. Since 1945, through no fault of their own, the U.S. military has been prevented by politicians who listen to just war theorists from applying the level of violence that's needed to make America safe.
And I think that's very interesting, because your primary focus in this book is protecting America, and you want to make that the foremost and the major priority in our foreign affairs.
Well, in our whole governmental structure, ma'am, America doesn't make sense to me if we're not organized in the first instance to protect our own country and our own people. In my own mind, if there's any presidential candidate out there who believes that the life of an enemy combatant is worth the life of an American on a one-to-one basis, I think that ought to disqualify him from being president immediately, or her.
Well, I totally agree with you on that, and I really think that once we get committed to a war, we have to go all out and not prolong it and continue having our people, our soldiers die at even a slow rate. But another thing that really brought home to me some problems with our present foreign policy is and you write about this, is our lack of knowledge of history, and also our denying cause and effect. And you addressed that very well in one of your first chapters, Getting to 9/11. And you go back to the Nixon administration and the events that you wrote about in the book. I remembered very well because I was in college at the time. So why don't you describe for the folks out there, how did we first get in this mess that eventually has led to us being in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, you mentioned, of course, Mr. Paul, and his philosophy, of course, is non-intervention unless American interests are extraordinarily threatened. And in 1973, almost willy-nilly, we became we involved ourselves in other people's wars, in this case, other people's religious wars, war between the Israelis and the Arabs. And now we find ourselves in the really absurd position of supporting both sides at the same time in a war in which we have no interests. First, by resupplying the Israelis with weapons during the 1973 war, a spigot that was opened and never shut, and by ignoring the oil embargo that the Saudis put on us in 1973, and we have ever since increased our dependence on foreign oil. And now the Saudis also own a huge amount of our debt. So we're really in a position where we've sacrificed over the years since 73 a large level of our independence, at least in terms of being able to decide when and where to go to war.
Why do you think we got involved to the extent that we did in 1973? Do you have any insight into what Nixon's motivations were at the time?
I think they viewed it primarily as a Cold War effort. They knew the Soviets were helping the Syrians and the Iraqis and the other people, and they thought it was a situation where the Americans should stand up and face down the Soviet Union. And that may well have been the case in 1973, and maybe it was the right thing to do. But unfortunately, the whole relationship with Israel from that point to now has never been reviewed. It's only gotten more expansive and more expensive to the point where now Americans are dying for the Israelis.
Yeah.
And I don't know how long the American public will put up with that.
I think you're exactly right when you say that our concern back then was the Soviets, because I distinctly remember in 1974 being a delegate to the Naval Academy Foreign Affairs Conference, and the entire topic was that permeated the whole conference was the Soviet Union's impact on the Middle East. And so I think that you're exactly right that was an attempt to really fight Soviet expansion, or what they perceived as Soviet expansionism. So I think you're exactly right about that. And, I distinctly remember the lines at the gas stations and the oil embargo. Do you think that was an effective embargo?
Well, it should have been an effective embargo to people in our political elite if they were concerned with protecting America. It should have been kind of a shot across the bow of our ship to say, listen, we can no longer depend on Arab police states for oil if this is what they can do. It should have been very effective. It was very much ignored. And right. Because it was easier to go along and get along.
Exactly. Well, we're coming up on a hard break, and we'll be right back after the break with my guest, Michael Scheuer, to discuss more of his books. Hello, it's Jerry Ward on I Object, Justice Examined, and I'm back with my guest, Michael F. Scheuer, and he is the author of Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. We are discussing that book right now, and when we left on the break, we were actually discussing why we chose to get involved in essentially wars that were not ours, that we really had no strategic interest in. And, one of the issues that we raised is the impact of the Cold War on that. And in fact, Mr. Scheuer, one of your chapters is entitled Fighting Islamists with a Blinding Cold War Hangover, 1996 to 2001. I mean, are we repeating actions or strategies that no longer have any real legitimacy because the Cold War is over?
I think that's right, Em. I think we haven't. All the politicians talk about the end of the Cold War and we have to have new thinking. But if you look at what we do in the world, it's as if the Cold War never ended. There's no sense of urgency, for example, in how we try to fix the problems we have. They go on forever, just as they did during the Cold War, because there was a nuclear standoff. But there's no standoff now, and our enemy is aggressive and very deadly. And we cannot continue to just try to manage this problem. We really have to destroy it. And I think in the other area that we are very much stuck in the Cold War is in the area of what used to be called proxies. When we supported one side and the Soviets supported another side.
And they went to war.
I'm sorry?
Okay. And they would go to war as our proxies, right?
Well, they would be our proxies in the sense that we America under Ronald Reagan was trying to stop the expansion of the Soviet Empire. And we would support Jonas Savimbi in Namibia or the Afghans in Afghanistan against the Soviets. Well, when we supported those people, they were going to fight anyway. They were dying for something they believed in. What we essentially did was give them AK-47s to kill Soviets instead of rifles that they had from the 19th century. So they were really fighting their own fight. Since the Cold War, we continue to believe that there are people out there who are like that. And I think Pakistan is the best example. Pakistan had no trouble at all with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and they agreed to help us in return for money. But they were never going to go after Al-Qaeda and try to capture bin Laden because it would really tear their country apart. And yet the greatest power on earth has delegated the responsibility to protect Americans to a third world dictator in Pakistan. And so it's very much a product of the Cold War.
Well, who is our biggest enemy now? Is it Al-Qaeda?
I think there's two tiers of threat. And I think General Hayden at CIA and Admiral McConnell have been very frank and honest about this. There were a refreshing change of pace after George Tenet. They've described Al-Qaeda as being reconstituted and refit and safely ensconced in the border areas of Pakistan. And I think that's absolutely true. And General Hayden told Meet the Press that they were ready to attack us again. That was just earlier this month. Unfortunately, we've also seen the evolution of a second tier of threat. Those people who are inspired or instigated by Al-Qaeda's words and actions, but who have no direct relationship, no command and control relationship with the main Al-Qaeda. People like the bombers of the subway in London, the people who tried to blow up that pipeline at Fort Dix in New Jersey, the medical doctors who tried to blow up the airport in Scotland. All of those people were inspired by Al-Qaeda, but they were acting off their own initiative. And so now America faces two tiers of threats from the people we call terrorists, and we're really not equipped to deal with that degree of threat.
Well, you talked about the proxy wars that we had in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, and one thing that you do talk about in your book is you quote our founding fathers about entangling alliances and discuss that sort of thing. And do you think that we should have gotten involved in all those proxy skirmishes or with the proxies in the 1980s? was Ronald Reagan's approach to foreign policy something that really benefited the United States, or did it lay the seeds for something that would come back and hurt us?
No, I don't think it did. My own view is that for all the talk about the post-Cold War period being a new age, the post-Cold War period is really a time that we've returned to what things were like before the Cold War. The Cold War itself was an anomaly, because never before had two powers possessed the ability to destroy the Earth in a matter of hours or weeks. And I have a great admiration for the people who managed that war from our side, because they were doing something no one had ever done before. What I would argue is that we need people who are now versed in experiences and history of the type that occurred before the Cold War. I think Ronald Reagan did what he needed to do to defeat the Soviets, and he did that. And I think all honor and praise should go to him for that. But that type of thinking doesn't apply to our current world, and so far we have continued to think along the same lines.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. The first Gulf War, my family is in the oil business, work for oil companies, and a lot of the people involved with oil companies at that time did not think that we should have gone over there to confront Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. And the reason that I was given by these people is because we can trade as well with Saddam Hussein as we can with the Kuwaitis. What is your assessment of what should Bush the first have gone over and kicked Saddam out of Kuwait?
Only if he was going to go to Baghdad and finish off Saddam.
Yeah, and that's one thing you talk about in your book. Did the failure to do that lay the seeds for some of what we've experienced the last decade?
Oh, I think so. I think when you go to war, even if myself, I opposed this war in Iraq very strongly, because I thought that it would make the war against al-Qaeda and its allies very much more difficult. But once you get into it, you have to win it. And we didn't do it in 1991. We're not doing it this time around. And we're going to be perceived as losing to the Islamist forces. And they're the only ones in the world who are now going to be able to claim that they defeated both superpowers. And so that's a tremendous galvanizing tool for them as they try to seek more support and more recruits. And it's a shame, because it didn't have to happen. But we have lost really the will to fight. We think that we can have our soldiers kill very few people and be very careful of civilians and take as long as it needs to be taken. And the world just doesn't work that way.
Well, it seems to me if we're not willing to fight all out, we shouldn't be there.
Well, I think that's exactly right. If you go to war, you go to war to win and finish it. The only mercy in war really is speed. Faster you finish it, the fewer people get killed. These long 6 and 7 year wars with no resolution in sight just ends up with. I actually think they're less just than a war that is undertaken to obliterate the enemy and finish the job and get it over with. I think the long, torturous process.
Well, I think the long, torturous process wreaks a lot of havoc on the lives of the civilians over there.
Well, ma'am, I agree with that, but I also think that we need to grow up a little bit in America. It's been so long since we had any threat to ourselves until 9/11 that we could feel and touch and that was tangible. We're involved now in two insurgencies. And in the history of man, insurgencies are among the most bloody wars because the enemy doesn't wear uniforms and because he lives amongst the civilian population that either supports him or has been intimidated by him. And if you're going to fight that kind of enemy, the reality is that it's a very manpower-intensive activity. You can't depend on air power. You can't depend on precision weapons. It's a matter of using your ground troops. And as a result, you have very heavy casualties on your own side and probably horrific casualties on the other side. So you really only have two choices. You either fight that war as it should be fought or you don't fight it at all.
Right. Well, what did you think of our approach to Afghanistan? I mean, you have a chapter in your book called Afghanistan, A Final Chance to Learn History Applies to America. What is that about?
Well, that chapter tried to show that almost everything we have done in Afghanistan could have been prevented in terms of mistakes if anyone had read the history of that country. Foreign invaders have only been successful once in Afghanistan, and that was the British in 1878 by delivering a punitive expedition. They marched from Kabul to Kandahar, did a great deal of destruction, and killed the enemies they were after at the start, and then left the country. And that's the only time that a foreign military activity in that country ever worked. Alexander, 4 centuries before Christ, the British 2 other times in the 19th century, and the Soviets in the 20th century tried a prolonged occupation and tried to rebuild the government in the image of the occupier, and they all lost. And so the lesson of history was not unclear in that regard. Our only real necessity in Afghanistan was to go in there and kill bin Laden and the Taliban and get out.
And not engaging in nation building.
That's so contradictory to what the founders gave us as guidance. They told us, and I'm not a deep scholar on this issue, but they never meant for American foreign policy to define who we are. We define who we are by spreading freedom and liberty and equal opportunity here at home. And they were very clear, whether it was Washington or even Jefferson or John Adams, that to the extent that we tried to build republics abroad in our own image, we would destroy our republic at home. And I think we're seeing that the founders were very insightful in that regard.
Well, is that sort of why one of your books is called Imperial Hubris, because it's sort of hubristic for us to expect that these nations that have thousands of years of history and governance would suddenly decide to ignore their traditions and adopt ours?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's an outrageous amount of arrogance or hubris. The Afghans, for example, have been in their country in that area for more than 2,000 years. They look at the Iranians as kind of the new kids on the block. What is a country like us who has 230 years experience, what are we going to teach them? Especially because they are Islamic and we're Christians. We don't even share a common religion. Well,
and what we seem to forget is that our system of government is pretty much built on biblical law from centuries ago, beginning in Europe.
Well, certainly, our countries. If you look at how our country has evolved, you have to start at 12:15 in Runnymede.
Exactly. Well, we're going to be right back after the break to talk more with Michael Scheuer regarding his book, Marching to Hell. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back. Hello, it's Jerry Ward back with Michael Scheuer, and we're going to continue talking about his book, Marching to Hell. And we were talking a little bit about Afghanistan, both before the break and kind of during the break. And you felt like we made some mistakes there using proxies and that sort of thing. And the question was asked of you during the break, well, do you think we should have used tactical nuclear weapons at Tora Bora? What do you think?
Well, my first preference would have been to use the soldiers who were on the ground and who were eager to do the job. But the generals decided they didn't want to have the bad publicity of getting too many casualties, so we entrusted it to some people who weren't going to do it. I would have favored anything that would have killed Osama bin Laden, up to and including a tactical nuclear weapon. The Tora Bora Mountains are a barren area with very few people in them. And that would have been one way to end one of the problems America is facing at the moment at a very important time.
Well, that's just disgusting for me to hear that it was the generals that pulled back because of fear of casualties. Because it just makes me wonder why why were we even over there if we weren't willing to go full bore?
Well, I think that must be a question that also troubles our soldiers and Marines, people who have been trained to do this and who want to do this, and then find their generals turning the job over to surrogates who can't be trusted. The two men they turned the job over to had a long record of association with bin Laden and supporting him during the war against the Soviets. And so it was certain that chasing him with surrogates was not going to work.
Well, it just seems so indirect and so feckless. And now what I think is here we have a situation in Iraq where we're paying both sides of the conflict, not Al-Qaeda, but both sides of the Sunni-Shia conflict, and even some of the Shias are fighting, like Sadr versus Malachi. What are we doing over there? And when should we get out?
My own view is that we should get out immediately. I think increasingly the only possible excuse for us to be there is because, unfortunately, the American political elite has pledged itself to Israel. And we can see already from one of the effects of the invasion of Iraq has been a decrease in Israeli security. Al-Qaeda and its allies are moving into Jordan, into Lebanon, and ever closer into Gaza. And my own guess is that no matter who's elected in the fall, whether it's McCain or Mrs. Clinton or Senator Obama, the next inauguration will see us there in Iraq simply because they realize that Israeli security will be greatly compromised if we leave.
Well, it seems like we've had some unintended consequences here. We want to protect Israel, yet our actions over there have actually made Israel less secure. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely, ma'am. I think that Israel has no greater enemy in the world than those Americans who call themselves neoconservatives. I think they have put Israel on the track to destruction. The American relationship with Israel historically has been very expensive, but only in terms of money. And I'm not sure how much the American people will tolerate a heavy expenditure of life in defense of another country where we have no interests. So people like Feith and Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, I think they ought to be on the top 10 list of Israeli enemies because they're certainly undermining Israeli security.
Yeah. Well, one thing about your book is you pull no punches. And I can tell that when you wrote some of your book, you're extremely angry about the position that our country's been put in with regard to how the war has been conducted, and also the choice that was made to not focus on bin Laden but to go in Iraq. And I understand that you've had a lot of pushback against your book from certain segments. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, there has been quite a bit of pushback, but most of it doesn't discuss the book. It discusses my attitude or my tone, or, I raised the issue that why are we supporting both the Saudis and the Israelis in a war where we have no interest? And the New York Times said if somebody says that, he doesn't even deserve to be considered. It's kind of a badge of honor in many ways because what's happening with my new book is just exactly what Giuliani and his like did to Mr. Paul in South Carolina last spring. You're a traitor.
Oh, yeah.
You're a traitor if you think there might be a better way to defend your country. And that's been the tone of some of the reviews. There have been good reviews, but the New York Times really put a nail in the coffin of this book, and I think they intended to.
Well, I can confirm because I've read a bunch of those reviews. They don't discuss your issues. They discussed that the anger and the righteous indignation that you have, which I think is ridiculous because our founding fathers wrote many an angry, righteously indignant tract, and in defense of our seeking independence from Great Britain. So that is certainly no reason to criticize your book. And you were just talking about the debate where Giuliani criticized Ron Paul because he tried to point out the cause and effect that if you go over to these Islamic nations and you occupy them and you interfere with what they perceive as their Muslim culture, you're going to get blowback.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you agree with him.
Congressman Paul couldn't have been more right on that. And, neither he nor I is saying anything, but you have to understand the motivation of the enemy if you're going to defeat him and protect America. We have 3 candidates left in this election for the presidency, and all of them are telling Americans that they hate us for our liberties and freedom and for gender equality. And as a result, it looks like the next 4 years will continue like the last 8. We'll be fighting an enemy that doesn't exist, while a smart, adaptable, and very religiously motivated enemy continues to make progress against us.
And part of the progress is breaking our economy, I think.
Yes.
And well, you have a humble suggestion in your book, because you are not one of these people who just blames America and would like to see America fail. You are very focused on America's defense. And why don't you summarize for us what your humble proposal is, so that everybody will be interested in going and buying your book and reading more about that?
Well, I think two of the very first things we needed to do after 9/11 were to close our borders and to establish effective immigration control, not to keep people out of the country, but to help law enforcement figure out who is in the country. Instead, we beefed up our security systems at official crossing points with billions of dollars of electronic gadgetry and left the borders wide open. So in many ways, we haven't secured North America at all.
Well, we've also given those easy visas to Saudis to come over.
Well, there's a madness in that relationship that the American people ought to begin to focus on. Osama bin Laden is not an aberration for Saudi society. He's the poster boy. And there's no country on earth, not Russia, not China, that's more dangerous to the United States of America than the Saudi Arabians.
Yeah,
and yet
amazing.
We continue to hold hands with them.
Yeah, it's amazing we call them friends. I don't mind buying their oil, but calling them friends,
it's a stretch.
It's just amazing to me. Well, I hope that everybody will go and read your book, Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. You can buy it at Amazon.com. And I want to thank you very much for being with me today, Mr. Scheuer.
It was a great pleasure, ma'am. Thank you very much for having me.
It was very interesting.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I'll be right back after the break to wrap up. Hello, I'm back for the last segment of I Object, Justice Examined, and I think that was a very interesting interview of Michael Scheuer, and I will say that I highly recommend his book, Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq, and you can find it at Amazon.com. That's where I got my copy. And he also has other books, and I've started reading Imperial Hubris, which was one of his earlier books that he, in fact, I believe when it first came out, he wrote under the pen name Anonymous before he essentially outed himself as a former CIA head of the bin Laden unit. So I think that you need to read different points of view about the Iraq War. And the thing about Mr. Scheuer's point of view is that he's not a pacifist leftist. He's definitely an American firster. He wants to protect America and defend America. And in fact, there are some parts of his book that I part places for because I'm not sure that I would be as violent in the approach of war, but that's just me, and maybe it's because I'm a female. I don't know. But he is definitely not a left-wing hippie pacifist. So I think his book is very valuable. I think that the reviews that I've read on it have been ridiculous, and they have been more about attacking the messenger than discussing the facts. And I've noticed that has been sort of a trend among critics. When they disagree with issues, they don't discuss the issues. They create straw men and try to knock them down and attack the messenger. So I highly recommend this book. I hope you'll read it. And I hope you will join me in 2 weeks for the next edition of I Object, Justice Examined. I want to thank everybody for being with me today, and I hope that you'll come back and listen again.
This is Right Talk Radio.